Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ever feel like you're giving too much or not getting enough in your relationships?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe you struggle to say no,
Yeah.
or someone in your life just doesn't seem to respect your limits.
Yeah, I've been there.
Well, get ready because in this deep dive, we're tackling a concept that might just change your life.
Okay.
Boundaries. We'll be exploring the book Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend.
Okay, great.
To understand what boundaries are, how they develop, and how to deal with common boundary problems, especially those tricky ones with family.
It's fascinating how something so fundamental to healthy relationships is often misunderstood.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
The book's core message is that boundaries are like property lines
Ooh.
for your soul, defining what you are responsible for, what you're not responsible for, and how to protect those precious things.
That analogy is so powerful, and it helps make the concept of boundaries more concrete. Think about it. Property lines define what you own, what you're responsible for, and what you're allowed to protect. Boundaries do the same for our lives,
Mm.
not just physically, but in our thoughts, feelings, values, and even how we use our time.
Speaking of time, I know you're busy, so let's get right to it. One story from the book that really stayed with me was about a woman named Sherry. Picture this. Her day is chaotic, overstuffed with demands from everyone around her. Her schedule is bursting, her mother's constantly making demands, her husband's passive-aggressive, and her son's having behavioral issues at school.
Well,
Sound familiar at all?
Sherry's story is a perfect example of how a lack of boundaries can leave you feeling overwhelmed and resentful. Like you're constantly giving but not receiving the same in return. It's easy to fall into that trap,
Mm-hmm.
especially for those who are naturally giving or struggle with saying no. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation where you felt stretched too thin?
Definitely. And the book talks about how a lack of boundaries like that can even lead to a feeling of losing yourself, which is a bit scary when you think about it.
Yeah.
But the good news is that boundaries can be learned and strengthened.
That's good.
The authors even provide a framework they call the 10 Laws of Boundaries. They're not strict rules,
Okay.
more like guiding principles.
Right. And while all the laws are valuable,
Yeah.
two that I think will resonate with you are the law of motivation and the law of exposure.
The law of motivation really struck a chord with me. The book tells the story of a guy named Stan,
Hmm.
who was always giving to others, but felt incredibly resentful. It turned out that his giving was motivated by fear, not love. I think we've all experienced those moments where we feel resentful or taken advantage of in a relationship.
For sure.
What stands out to you about this, and how does the law of exposure fit in?
Well, it's so common to give out of obligation or fear, but that rarely leads to healthy relationships. The law of motivation reminds us that true giving should come from a place of love. And when we're motivated by love, it's easier to set healthy boundaries because we're not afraid of the consequences.
Right.
That's where the law of exposure comes in.
Yeah.
You can't just set boundaries in your head and expect everyone to magically understand and respect them.
Right.
You have to communicate them clearly to the people in your life.
That makes sense. But sharing your boundaries can be scary, right?
It can be.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to start by exposing your boundaries to safe people, those you trust to support you and give you honest feedback. Think of it like having a team of cheerleaders and coaches in your corner.
Okay.
They can help you stay strong when setting boundaries feels challenging.
I love that analogy. So we've talked about what boundaries are and how important they are. But what about when things go wrong? What are some common boundary problems we might encounter, especially in our families?
Well, family is where we first learn about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, sometimes those early experiences can create some real challenges when it comes to boundaries.
The book gives some relatable examples,
Hmm.
like triangulation, where family members avoid direct communication and instead talk about each other behind their backs, or financial dependence, where adult children rely on their parents' money, which can lead to control issues and stifle personal growth. Have you ever experienced either of those dynamics in your own family?
These are just a couple of examples, and they highlight how deeply ingrained family patterns can become. Other common issues are emotional enmeshment, where it's hard to separate your own needs and feelings from those of your family members, and guilt trips, where manipulation is used to get you to do what someone else wants. These situations can be incredibly tough to navigate, especially with relatives.
Totally. We've all probably got that one relative who immediately springs to mind, right?
Yeah.
But dealing with boundary problems in families can be incredibly stressful. It can feel almost impossible to set limits with people you're so closely connected to. Where do we even begin to untangle those messes?
You're absolutely right. It can be incredibly challenging. But the key is to remember that it's not about blaming anyone. It's about recognizing those unhealthy patterns and making healthier choices for yourself. The book even uses the idea of adoption to describe this shift.
Okay.
As adults, we move from under the authority of our parents to under the authority of God, taking on more responsibility for our own lives and decisions.
That's an interesting way to look at it. It's about recognizing that as adults, we have the power to choose how we want to relate to our families, even if it means setting boundaries that might be met with resistance.
Exactly. And remember, setting boundaries isn't about cutting people off. It's about creating healthy, sustainable relationships where everyone feels respected and valued. But that doesn't always mean it's going to be easy.
And speaking of challenging, setting boundaries isn't just about other people, is it? It's about setting them with ourselves, too, which can be even harder. But before we dive into that, I think it's time for a quick break. We'll be back soon to explore the complexities of setting boundaries with ourselves and how it relates to personal growth and self-care.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were starting to unravel the complexities of setting boundaries, not just with others, but with ourselves too. And I have to admit, this is where I personally struggle the most. It's so much easier to point out boundary issues in other people's lives than to address my own,
You're
you
not
know.
alone there. Setting boundaries with ourselves can be incredibly challenging. It requires self-control, self-respect, and taking full responsibility for our own well-being.
And in a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages about productivity and achievement, it's easy to feel like we need to be on all the time, neglecting our own needs in the process. It's like we're running on a hamster wheel, constantly striving but never really arriving. How do we even begin to break free from that cycle? That's such a good point. It's like we've internalized this always-on mentality,
Hmm.
and it's exhausting. Setting boundaries with ourselves can look like setting limits on things like eating, spending money, or managing our time. Think about areas in your life where you tend to overextend yourself or feel pulled in too many directions. Where could you benefit from creating some healthier limits?
Ooh, that's hitting a little too close to home. I know I definitely have a tendency to overcommit, especially when it comes to work and social engagements. I hate letting people down. So I often end up saying yes to things I really don't have the time or energy for, and
Mhm.
then I end up feeling resentful and burnt out. It's a vicious cycle.
It's a classic people-pleasing pattern,
Hmm.
and it's so common. But the book emphasizes that learning to say no to ourselves, even when it's hard, is essential for our well-being. It's about resisting those impulses that might feel good in the moment, but have negative consequences in the long run. Think of Jessica's story from the book.
Oh, yeah. Jessica struggled with an eating disorder, and her story really highlighted how difficult it can be to set those internal boundaries, to control certain behaviors and break those bad habits. Have you ever struggled with similar challenges where it feels like you're battling against yourself?
Jessica's story is a powerful example of how those internal battles can play out.
Hmm.
And it's important to recognize that setting boundaries with ourselves isn't just about controlling our behavior. It's also about recognizing and challenging negative self-talk or limiting beliefs that might be holding us back.
So true. Sometimes those negative thoughts can be our worst enemy. It's like we
Yeah.
have this inner critic that's constantly telling us we're not good enough, or that we need to more, be more, have more. How do we silence that inner critic and start treating ourselves with more kindness and compassion?
That's a great question. And it ties back to the idea of self-care, which is so essential when it comes to setting boundaries with ourselves. It's about making time for activities that nourish and recharge us, things that bring us joy and help us feel connected to ourselves. What are some things that fill your cup and help you feel more grounded?
For me, it's all about spending time in nature. Whether it's going for a hike in the woods, taking a walk on the beach, or simply sitting in my backyard listening to the birds sing. Being in nature always helps me feel more centered and at peace. It's like a reset button for my mind and soul.
That's beautiful. And it highlights how self-care can be so individual. What works for one person might not work for another. The important thing is to find what nourishes you and make it a priority.
And the book also emphasizes that setting boundaries with ourselves isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process that requires constant awareness and effort. Why do you think we encounter so much resistance to setting boundaries, both from ourselves and others?
Resistance is a natural part of the process. We've already talked about some of the external resistance we might encounter from others: anger, guilt trips, manipulation, even withdrawal. But sometimes the most challenging resistance comes from within.
You mentioned earlier that we can be our own biggest obstacle when it comes to setting boundaries. What does that internal resistance look like, and why is it so powerful?
It can manifest in so many ways, and it often boils down to fear. Fear of conflict, fear of hurting others, fear of rejection, or even a distorted sense of responsibility. where we feel like we need to take care of everyone else's needs before our own.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how these fears can drive our behavior without us even realizing it.
Totally. And the book shares a pretty extreme example of this resistance in Brian's story. His wealthy father cut him off financially when he started setting boundaries. It's a stark reminder that sometimes setting boundaries comes at a cost, but it also highlights the incredible freedom and self-respect that come with it. What price are you willing to pay for freedom and authenticity? It's a question worth pondering, right?
It is. And it's a question that can lead to some deep self-reflection. Because sometimes the price we pay for not setting boundaries is even greater. We might end up feeling resentful, depleted, and disconnected from ourselves. It's like we're slowly sacrificing our own well-being on the altar of other people's expectations.
And that's a recipe for disaster in the long run. But how do we know if we're on the right track? What does success with boundaries actually look like?
That's such a good question. And the answer might surprise you. Success with boundaries isn't about controlling others or avoiding conflict altogether.
Okay, I'm intrigued. If it's not about control or conflict avoidance, then what is it about? How can we measure our progress?
It's about feeling a greater sense of peace and control in your own life. It's about having more fulfilling and respectful relationships where you feel seen and heard. And it's about being able to pursue your goals and dreams with greater clarity and focus, because you're no longer weighed down by other people's demands or expectations.
I love that. It's about creating a life that feels aligned with your values and aspirations. And remember Sherry, after she started setting boundaries, her life transformed. Not only did she feel less stressed and resentful, but her relationships improved, and her work life even got better. It's a reminder that setting boundaries can have a ripple effect, positively impacting multiple areas of our lives.
It's a great example of how boundaries create a win-win situation for everyone involved. And it highlights the importance of recognizing that we're all interconnected. When we take care of ourselves, we're also better equipped to take care of others.
So true. But setting boundaries, especially in certain relationships, can be particularly challenging.
You're right. Family dynamics and romantic relationships often come with a unique set of complexities when it comes to boundaries.
Let's start with family. What are some of the unique challenges that might arise when setting boundaries with family members?
Well, family relationships often come with a lot of history and baggage. We might have deeply ingrained patterns of relating that are hard to break. It's like those family dynamics are on autopilot, and it can be tough to deviate from those established roles and expectations. Think about your own family dynamics. What are some patterns that might be creating challenges for you when it comes to setting boundaries?
My family is very close-knit, which is wonderful in many ways. But it can also make it difficult to assert my own individuality and independence. I often feel pressure to conform to certain expectations, even if they don't align with my own values or desires. It's like there's this unspoken rule that we need to maintain harmony at all costs, even if it means sacrificing our own needs.
That's a common experience, especially in families that prioritize togetherness and harmony. And it highlights another challenge that can arise when setting boundaries with family members. They might not always be supportive or understanding of your need for limits.
Right, and that can be so hurtful, especially when it comes from the people you love most. The book gives some examples of how family members might react to boundaries, like guilt trips, emotional manipulation, or even outright rejection. Those reactions can be incredibly difficult to deal with. And it's easy to get pulled back into old patterns in an attempt to avoid conflict or maintain peace. What advice would you give to someone who's facing that kind of resistance from their family?
It's crucial to remember that you can't control other people's behavior. You can only control your own responses. So if a family member is trying to guilt trip you or manipulate you, try to acknowledge their feelings without giving in to their demands. You can say something like, I understand you're upset, but this is what I need.
It's about standing firm in your boundary, even when it's uncomfortable, right? And it's also about recognizing that setting boundaries with family members doesn't mean you love them any less. It's actually an act of self-love and respect, and it can ultimately lead to healthier and more authentic relationships.
Exactly. And sometimes setting clear expectations with family members about what you are and are not willing to do can help. It might be uncomfortable in the short term, but it can save a lot of heartache and resentment in the long run.
Now, what about romantic relationships? They bring their own set of challenges when it comes to boundaries, don't they?
Absolutely. Romantic relationships often involve intense emotions and a desire for closeness, which can sometimes make it harder to establish and maintain clear boundaries. It's like we want to merge into one being with our partner, and boundaries can feel like They're creating separation or pushing our partner away.
It's interesting because the book actually argues the opposite, that healthy boundaries are actually essential for intimacy in romantic relationships.
Exactly. It might seem counterintuitive,
Mm.
but it makes sense when you think about it. When we have clear boundaries, we can be more authentic and vulnerable with our partners because we know that our individuality is respected. We don't feel the need to constantly mold ourselves to their expectations or sacrifice our own needs to maintain harmony.
So it's about creating a space where both partners feel safe to be themselves without fear of judgment or rejection. That sounds incredibly freeing.
It is. And it's about recognizing that each partner has their own needs, desires, and limits. It's not about creating a codependent relationship where one person's needs are constantly being sacrificed for the other.
Right. And the book emphasizes that setting boundaries in romantic relationships is an ongoing process. What does that look like in practice? How do we navigate those conversations about needs and limits with our partners?
It's all about communication. Open, honest, and respectful communication is key. It's about being able to articulate our needs clearly and being willing to listen to our partner's needs with empathy and understanding. It's not always easy, especially when those needs clash. But the book provides some helpful strategies for navigating those difficult conversations.
I imagine those conversations can get pretty heated sometimes, especially when dealing with topics like physical touch, emotional intimacy, or even just how we spend our time. What are some tips for keeping those conversations constructive, even when emotions run high?
The book emphasizes the importance of staying focused on the problem, not the person. It's about avoiding blaming or attacking each other, and instead focusing on finding solutions that work for both partners. It's also helpful to remember that compromise is important, but it shouldn't come at the expense of our core values or well-being.
Compromise without sacrificing our core selves. That's a delicate balance. But having those open and honest conversations, even when they're tough, can ultimately lead to a deeper level of intimacy and understanding in the relationship.
Absolutely. It's about creating a dynamic where both partners feel safe to express their needs and boundaries, knowing that they will be met with respect and consideration. And that's the foundation for a strong, healthy, and lasting relationship.
So we've talked about the importance of setting boundaries with others, with ourselves, and how those principles play out in both family and romantic relationships. We've explored the resistance we might face and some practical tips for navigating those challenges.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Yeah.
But there's one more crucial aspect of boundaries we haven't touched on yet: forgiveness.
Ooh, that's a big one. How does forgiveness tie into setting healthy boundaries, especially when those boundaries have been crossed?
The book argues that forgiveness is essential for setting healthy boundaries, especially when we've been hurt or wronged by others. Holding on to anger and resentment can keep us trapped in unhealthy patterns. It's like we're giving the person who hurt us power over our emotions and well-being.
So forgiveness is about releasing that power and reclaiming our own freedom. But how do we forgive someone who has hurt us deeply, especially if they haven't acknowledged their wrongdoing or apologized for their actions? It can feel almost impossible sometimes, like we're betraying ourselves or letting them off the hook.
You're right, it's not easy. And it's definitely not about condoning the other person's behavior or pretending it didn't happen. Forgiveness is about choosing to let go of the anger and resentment that's weighing us down. Not for the other person's benefit, but for our own. It's about freeing ourselves from the pain of the past so we can create a more fulfilling future. What are your thoughts on this? Have you ever struggled with forgiveness in a situation where someone crossed your boundaries?
I have, and it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I kept replaying the situation in my mind, feeling hurt and angry all over again. But I eventually realized that by holding on to those negative emotions, I was only hurting myself. Forgiveness was a process, and it took time, but it was ultimately the most liberating decision I could have made.
That's such a powerful testimony. And it highlights that forgiveness is often a journey, not a one-time event. The book offers some helpful insights into that journey, emphasizing that it might involve working through those difficult emotions with the help of a therapist or a trusted friend. It's important to have support during that process.
It's about being patient with ourselves and allowing the process to unfold naturally, without judgment or pressure. And it's also about recognizing that forgiveness is ultimately a gift we give to ourselves. It's about choosing to release the burden of anger and resentment so we can experience more peace and freedom. And speaking of freedom, I think it's time for a quick break before we move on to our final thoughts and takeaways from this deep dive into the world of boundaries. Welcome back. We've covered so much ground in our deep dive into boundaries, from defining what they are to navigating the complexities of setting them with others and even ourselves. I'm curious to hear what stood out most to you from our conversation so far. What's resonating with you the most, or maybe what's sparking some new questions?
It's amazing how this seemingly simple concept can be so profound and multifaceted, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think one of the most important things the book highlights is that setting boundaries isn't about becoming cold or heartless. It's not about shutting people out or creating distance in our relationships. It's actually quite the opposite.
You're right. Boundaries are about creating space for genuine connection and love. They help us build healthier and more fulfilling relationships where everyone feels respected and valued.
The book uses this incredible metaphor of a garden to illustrate this idea. It's so vivid.
Yes, the garden metaphor is so powerful. It shows how boundaries like a fence around a garden protect and nurture growth. The fence provides structure and a safe space for the plants to flourish without being trampled on or overrun by weeds.
It's the same with our lives. Boundaries create that safe and healthy space for our well being to blossom and for our relationships to thrive.
Exactly. And another key takeaway for me is that setting boundaries is an act of courage.
I love that. Why courage? It doesn't always feel courageous, especially when you're dealing with pushback or guilt trips.
Because it often requires stepping outside our comfort zones and challenging those ingrained patterns of people-pleasing or conflict avoidance. Think about it. It takes courage to say no when you're used to saying yes, or to speak up for yourself when you're used to staying silent.
That's so true. And the more we practice setting boundaries, the more confident and courageous we become. It's like we're building a muscle, a boundary muscle.
I love that analogy, a boundary muscle.
Yeah.
It definitely takes practice and repetition to strengthen it, but the rewards are worth the effort.
Now, besides the garden analogy and the idea of courage, what else resonates with you as a key takeaway from our deep dive?
What struck me the most is the idea that boundaries are a gift we give to ourselves and the others.
That's such a beautiful way to frame it. How is it a gift to both ourselves and the people in our lives?
When we set boundaries, we're honoring our needs and limits, and that's a profound act of self-love and respect. It's a gift to ourselves because it allows us to live in greater alignment with our values and priorities.
That makes sense. But how does setting boundaries become a gift to others?
Think about it this way. When we communicate our boundaries clearly, we give others the gift of clarity and responsibility. They know what to expect from us, and they're free to make their own choices without feeling obligated to meet our needs or expectations.
It's like we're creating a more equitable and respectful dynamic where everyone can thrive.
Exactly. And that's the foundation for truly authentic and fulfilling connections.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to share one last anecdote from the book that really resonated with me. Remember Sherry, the woman we talked about earlier, who was constantly overwhelmed and resentful because she didn't have any boundaries?
Yes. Her story is such a powerful reminder of how transformative setting boundaries can be.
Well, after Sherry started setting those boundaries, not only did her own life improve drastically, her relationships became healthier and more fulfilling, and her work life even blossomed. And what truly struck me was that she realized setting boundaries wasn't about rejecting the people she loved, it was about loving them better.
Wow, that's so powerful. It's about creating a space where love can flow freely and authentically without the weight of resentment or obligation.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that true love respects boundaries and doesn't demand self-sacrifice or compromise our well-being.
That's a beautiful message to leave our listeners with. Setting boundaries is ultimately about fostering deeper, healthier, and more fulfilling connections with ourselves and the people we care about.
We hope this deep dive into boundaries has given you a fresh perspective on this essential concept. Remember, it's your life, your time, and your energy. Protect what matters most.
Absolutely. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. The book is a fantastic resource, and you can always reach out to trusted friends or therapists for support as you embark on this journey of creating healthier boundaries in your life.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Boundaries by Dr. Henry Cloud and Dr. John Townsend to explore these ideas further. It's truly a game changer.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration into a topic that will empower you to live a more fulfilling and meaningful life.